and welcome to the very first episode of Beyond the Playbook, where we go beyond the game to explore the business, diplomacy, and power moves shaping the world of sports. We are kicking things off with an exciting theme, sports and diplomacy, where the real action happens off the field. And to launch this pretty exciting journey, we have a very special first guest, Jonathan Miseroy, a leading expert in global sports diplomacy. From the FIFA World Cup to international relations, this conversation is a must watch for anyone who loves sports, strategy, and the politics behind the game. But before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon because we have plenty more game changing insights coming your way. Now, let's dive in. Joining us today is someone who has been at the forefront of sports diplomacy and global strategy, Jonathan Miseroy. Jonathan is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Hadaf Global, leading groundbreaking initiatives that use sports as a tool for international diplomacy. He has worked extensively with governments, NGOs, and UN agencies, building bridges between nations through the power of sport. Previously, he played a key role in shaping the legacy of the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022 as the head of partnerships and strategy at the Generation Amazing Foundation. His expertise in soft power, international relations, and public diplomacy has made him a leading voice in the industry. He's also a published author, having co authored a book on sports diplomacy and soft power in the context of the FIFA World Cup. Today, he's here to share his insights on how sports are shaping global politics, strategy, and influence. So, Jonathan, welcome to this podcast. Welcome to Beyond the Playbook.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on this journey with you.
Yeah. So before we go into the nitty gritty, let's just like get you comfortable first. So I would, I want to, I'm very curious as to how your career journey has been and how you transitioned specifically into the sector of sports diplomacy. That is one thing which is I find to be very cool and interesting.
Yeah, of course. I've been through a few different roles. Originally, my university degree was in international relations. I have a very strong focus on the Middle East. Being born and raised in Qatar, and going to university at a time where there was what we could call political turmoil in the Gulf specifically. My bachelor's thesis and my master's thesis were both about the 2017 diplomatic crisis in the Gulf. Um, so I'd say, I started off with international relations. I moved over to Sweden to do my master's degree. For the first couple of years, I was a research assistant in London and then in Stockholm. And then I took on a job in the world of development. So I worked with a American human rights and democracy organization based out of the US, but with an office in Sweden, and they launched their first office in Sweden. And I took on a sort of managerial role, although I was a volunteer. I would say as they were launching and they needed someone with experience, I took on that role. Fast forward to COVID, returning to Doha, returning to be with my family. I did some development work with a high level personality in the country, and then was offered the opportunity to work at the Generation Amazing Foundation. The idea being my background in international relations, my interest in public diplomacy, my interest in strategic thought, strategic planning, and then potentially also some of the work that I was doing around creating strategies for long-term goals was something that was of interest to management at the time. So yeah, I worked pretty hands-on with the Generation Amazing Foundation. So a lot of high level visits, a lot of high level activations, exchanges, putting together a 5-year strategy built around the concept of sports diplomacy from a state slash non-state perspective. And then, of course, the World Cup finished 2022. The foundation was that it would always continue on. So me and a few friends, partners, colleagues decided it was time to start branching out. Obviously, the Middle East is going to be the center of the world for the next 10, 12, 15 years in the world of mega sporting events. And we've decided now that it's an opportunity to put together a consultancy that looks at things maybe a little bit differently, stand shoulder to shoulder with their clients, but also is ultimately looking to create sustainable impact, sustainable development, human development. And I would say my sort of points of interest at the moment, of course, are things like sports diplomacy, but the the nexus between grassroots human development and sports diplomacy is an incredibly important and exciting space. And the concepts of grassroots sports diplomacy are also becoming more well known, more written about, and the way in which they can change people's perceptions. So yeah, I would say fundamentally our focus is, although I'm not Qatari, as I mentioned, our focus is south to south development. So countries like Qatar working with other countries in the global south and shifting the sort of balance of power away from the traditional global north to places that are looking to do new and interesting things.
Yeah, I think the Middle East in general is a pretty. It started off as a different world, right? A different world within the world. So it's a pretty interesting way in which, and its position in sports as well is, especially in the coming years, as you mentioned, the next 10 to 15 years, it makes it a very interesting, confluence of how we do stuff. So that's a
Yeah.
pretty interesting way in which, how you explain it also. Like I'm pretty, fascinated by it as well. So one question which I had in mind, like what inspired you to think of sports as a medium to for diplomacy in general?
I would say it's a combination of two things. I would say, people might jump back a little bit when I say it. I'm not the biggest sports fan. I don't watch sports so often. I play sports. I love engaging in sports and being healthy. But for me, it's not so much about watching it. It's what sports can do. It's what sports can do for community. It's what sports can do for development. It transcends borders, it transcends culture, it transcends politics to an extent, although the world of sports diplomacy does get a little bit political. I would say what was also quite inspiring for me was the concept of legacy built around the World Cup in Qatar. Of course, Qatar had a much longer build up to the delivery of its World Cup. I would say that Qatar had strategic foresight to create a multitude of different legacy initiatives. And I think ultimately what's so interesting to me is the long-term impact. It could be the educational programs, it could be the policy shifts, it could be the cultural exchanges. But ultimately, it's the ability for people to communicate with one another through impactful programming that doesn't necessarily fit to a standard sort of way in which education might be perceived. You young people may not engage as well in a classroom, but they may go on a football field and they may learn from their coach. They may learn from their teammates about things like leadership. Um, and I'd say, it's just that interesting sort of space in which you can use it to change people's perceptions. So yeah, that's maybe what would be the thing that inspired me is that human
Yeah,
element to it.
yeah, you're like I think me and Sai can attest to the fact that our lecturer, Doctor, Rahul sir, he also attests to he subscribed to your point of view, and he believes in how the power of sport is a very important way in which, well, global geopolitics can be, I'm not saying it can be any, conflicts can be resolved, but it can be a tool to,
Yeah,
maybe shift dialogue in a different direction.
for sure.
So yeah, let's go on to the work which you specifically do, right? So that is, you're the, as you mentioned, as I mentioned in the intro, you're the co-founder as well as the chief strategy officer at Hada Global.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask, what are the initiatives that you've spearheaded that highlight the role of sports diplomacy while there?
Yeah, so I would say we're in the early stages. Official launch is very very soon, but we've been sort of in conversations now with a multitude of different clients. I would say the work that we're essentially looking at doing is creating long-term meaningful impact for a whole wide range of different organizations, may they be private, public, or third sector. We're looking at doing, CSR driven sports projects. So working with, potentially with companies that are looking to revamp their CSR, looking at doing, a strategic overview and analysis of all of the assets that they already have, and then turning it into something that's more impactful, something that has a thread to it, something that isn't just one off. It's looking at genuine impact with real, measurable effects. Um, we're also looking at, longer term, working with, potentially with organizations in countries around the Middle East, but potentially in South America, because one of my partners, Kelly Nascimento, is Brazilian herself. But the paradigm between the South and the South. So what I was talking about earlier, it's potentially working with organizations to provide educational exchanges, cultural exchanges, the ability for them to tell their own narrative through their history, their sports, and their culture. And then finally, partnerships potentially with UN agencies, governments, and federations at a high level. Uh, I see these as maybe advisory level work, potentially working with governments that are looking at, say for example, a 5-year long-term strategy on how to um, potentially get more people to have access to sports, but allow more women to play sports, for example, and then also tell that story globally. So it's the ability for us to turn that, it's what we call positive proof points, into impactful storytelling and communications at the end of it all.
Yeah, that's pretty insightful. You did mention a very interesting name, Kelly Nascimento. So, like, if people are like very know their football, she's the daughter of the famous, one of the great football players, Pele. So that is the context, and also I think on a, like, as a side note, I've been trying to connect with her on LinkedIn as well. So like that is also to regarding another matter. So that is a pretty interesting name which you brought up. So yeah, I mean, you did work at the Generation Amazing Foundation, with at least with relation to the FIFA World Cup. So I wanted to know, what was your overall experience while with that foundation?
Yeah, I think Generation Amazing Foundation was what set me on the path for where I am now. I would claim that it's one of the most impactful legacy initiatives of a FIFA World Cup to ever come out. The work is across 75 different countries across the world. Topics such as youth leadership, training, but also things like education, and then also sustainable development, so infrastructure, um, from a bottom up perspective. I would say that some of the insights that I had during the World Cup was that, it's Qatar got a lot of flack for the World Cup. A lot of people came into it with a preconceived conception of what the global South is, and ultimately what the Middle East is. And I think the Generation Amazing Foundation is a testament to how sports can be used to better people's lives, and not exclusively for the country that is hosting the World Cup. I think when we say World Cup, or when we say Olympics, we think global events that ultimately affect everyone. And I think for the longest time, legacy around those events has always been very much hyper national. So either the city that might be hosting the Olympics or the country that may be hosting the World Cup will genuinely feel a legacy impact in some way. But what I think Qatar did quite nicely and did from the very beginning was say that this is not a World Cup just for Qatar. It's a World Cup for the region, and ultimately a World Cup for the world. And I think that's really what sort of pushed me into kind of seeing the value of sport and sports diplomacy, is that you can, if you do things properly with strategic foresight and you have your priorities set, you are able to also affect countries that may neighbor you. Now, of course, not every country is going to be looking to impact the rest of the world. But for example, we're about to go into the first cycle of having three countries hosting a World Cup, followed by six in some manner. The World Cups are generally becoming more global, and I think there has to be a way in which we are able to bottle up some of that goodwill and development and share it around. And I think it harkens back to that thing I was saying about sports fundamentally bringing us together. That's maybe the insight that I have to share about the World Cup in itself. It was maybe not what everyone saw, but very, very innovative in many ways.
Yeah, I think one thing you did mention how Qatar was perceived, or before and during the thing. I think one thought would be the legacy Western media. There is a media plays an important role in how certain countries are perceived as well. And I think the 2034 World Cup, it will be hosted in Saudi Arabia. So that is something I hope certain attitudes are changed by then. I mean, these countries do have a lot to work on, but they're not as negative as what is perceived. There are a lot of ways
Yeah,
in
of
which there are
course.
a lot of good work being done, I feel.
Yeah, and I'd say, we've every country has been at a point where things needed to change. It's very orientalist for someone to be sitting on their throne in a country that has been developing for the past, you know 2000 years, for example. We all go through different phases, and development isn't a linear line, and development also doesn't have to follow one set standard. There's no A and B. There's a gray area of development. I think every country should develop at its own pace, of course, to international norms, yes, but it can't just be overnight. It takes time.
So I just wanted to know your thoughts on how sports diplomacy in general it helps in fostering relationships between the countries. So like the Olympics, for example, has over 200 plus nations taking part in it, and the World Cups, at least from the next World Cup onwards, we are going to have nearly a quarter of the world taking part in it with 48 countries. So like, how does it build dialogue, or how does it create the connection? That's one thing I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I mean, there's amazing case studies and stories about sports diplomacy being used, where famous ping pong players were playing in China from the United States, and games
Yeah.
of chess. There's cases of Didier Drogba stopping a war in the Ivory Coast, for example. But I think if we really dilute it down, or boil it down to the fundamentals, it's the ability for countries to interact with one another on a equal playing field, and being able to interact with one another while their fans and people around also see this interaction. It's people to people engagement that's beyond politics. It's about winning, yes, in many ways, but it isn't necessarily about conquering or overpowering one. It's more just about doing it for the love of the game. Um, I'd say, some really nice examples from previous work that I had done at GA, related to, perception, maybe that we've done school exchanges, for example, during the World Cup. We did the first ever school exchange linked to a World Cup, where we brought close to 400 youth from almost every participating nation of the World Cup to Qatar to take part in a youth festival where they learned from one another. Yes, they did play sport, but they also did capacity building training. They went through leadership training. They went through a range of different things like how to conduct a needs assessment, how to conduct a gender analysis. And the end goal was that, yes, they came to Qatar and they learned from one another. They learned all of these skills. But when they went home, they took back the learning and then did their own project management phase where they were implementing on the ground. Now, I think some of the really amazing stories that we got out of that were youth that came over to Qatar and said, I've been told this for the past 10 years about Qatar, that it's X and Y. And when I got there, I actually realized that everyone was smiling, everyone was there, everyone felt safe, everyone felt as though they were there to enjoy themselves, and they learned something new. They learned a new culture. And then one young man said, "I wish everyone had the opportunity to go over and see things like this. I think the world would be a much less racist place if people had access to travel, to see, to do." And I think that's what it boils down to. Sports diplomacy is very, very closely linked to the concept of cultural diplomacy, but ultimately it's that people to people diplomacy and engagement at the end of it all. It's shifting one's narrative through real world change and real world impact.
Yeah. So like, I think the next question which I'm about to ask is a pretty, it's pretty relevant in the context that we just 4 years back, we went through 4 to 5 years back, we went through a global pandemic. So I would just wanted to ask, how do you see, sports diplomacy as a sector or as a field evolving in the post-pandemic world? Because we do know that, the world was shut down for nearly a year, and how that affects, how affects our interactions in a particular way. That's especially with the increasing role of your digital platforms. That's a very interesting way I find it, growing, I guess.
Yeah, look, I think the whole world has had to change. But, we're doing it right now. We're doing an interview over an application. We're speaking with one another on two different countries in very different time zones. But I think it's the rise in digital engagement, it's the virtual exchanges. And also, although I'm not really interested or play games, I'd say esports is also something that's very quickly becoming a dominant role in society for young people to meet one another and talk to one another. I'd say a shift towards the ability for hybrid event models and broader accessibility is incredibly important, of course. We'll never beat sitting face to face with someone, of course, but it is giving people an option to attend without having to for example, fly 8 hours. And then I'd also say that the rise in you know additional sort of platforms for storytelling is quite important. So things like TikTok, yes, Instagram, Facebook, and a whole range of different things like shorts on YouTube. The ability for people to tell quick stories and proactive stories is becoming more important. It's important that nations, organizations understand that there is a narrative, and there's a narrative to be changed through the storytelling. But there needs to be a concerted effort to have what I said earlier, the positive proof points. So you can't just create a story out of thin air. You actually have to have something that's tangible and impactful before you start telling that story. But I think the pandemic is allowing people to, or post-pandemic world is allowing people to connect in new and exciting ways. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, the world, the way we are, progressing digitally as well as technologically. Sorry, technologically, that's helping us, make the world a more close knit. I feel, as a community, as a more global community as well. So that's pretty interesting. Now, as part of your work, you work with a lot of UN agencies, a lot of NGOs, a lot of government agencies. So how, there, I mean, I'm pretty sure there might be a lot of bureaucracy which is involved when you deal with such, different stakeholders. So how do you navigate that? That's a pretty interesting way. I would like. It's a pretty. I think you will need a lot more, man management while doing that. I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's differing priorities, right? There's national interests, there's grassroots interests, and then there's policy interests. I'd say it's finding sustainability beyond the initial funding cycles, especially as we you've seen the news very recently. Things are changing very quickly. Development agencies are going through a particularly tough time at the moment. It's ensuring that there's a wide gamut of fundraising opportunities for organizations, of course, but also additional support from the private sector through, for example, CSR or ESG. And then it's also being able to adapt, I would say, quickly to differing and changing policy outlooks and policy or national interests. So I think sustainability is the channel that one of the challenges. I'd also say that designing the programs that align with the global priorities. So what we did quite well at GA was anchor ourselves to the UN SDGs. So it's something that a lot of organizations are doing nowadays and have been doing. But what that does for you is it enables you to find common ground with other organizations outside of your close circle. So you can find, I always when I talk about challenges, I say I believe in the power of Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is partnerships, and
Yeah.
I think that also harkens back to this world of sports diplomacy, right? Because you could work with an organization in another country that might be on a slightly different path to you, but is doing similar work or reasonable work that doesn't sway too far out of what you're doing, or maybe it is something that you aren't doing but you'd like to be doing. Um, and I find it far more sustainable to partner up with an organization that has similar values. But yeah, I'd say it's a anchoring yourself to something like the UN SDGs or the Kazan National Plan for Development, and then finding a network of other organizations that are trying to do the same thing. It means that there's an abundance mindset. There's money out there for all of us. We just have to do it collectively and find a way to be smart with how we do it.
Yeah. Like so, as you know, this entire field is a pretty vast field. So I don't want to take much more of your like. If we go into the nitty-gritty, we'll be here forever, and I don't
Yep,
want to
of
take
course.
more of your valuable time as well. And even the attention span of people when they're watching videos is less also. So
Yeah.
I will. I want to give like a concluding question. So we all know that climate change and inclusivity are issues which are very in the mainstream right now, and people are being more and more aware of it. So how do you see sports diplomacy? This is a more future facing question. I understand, and you may not have the answer to it also. Probably there's something in the works also. How do you see sports diplomacy in addressing these issues like inclusivity, climate change, and your proper these geopolitical conflicts in general?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're trying to tackle at Hadaf Global. We believe that they can address global issues in tangible ways. Climate change can be tackled through sustainable infrastructure, eco-friendly sporting events, but also the sort of the sustainable programming between different countries through sustainable funding cycles. Inclusivity can be promoted through programs for underrepresented persons, refugees, people with disabilities, people from disenfranchised peoples groups or IDPs, or even people who may not have access to general access to equipment or facilities. And then also sport has been an incredibly valuable peace building tool. It can be used and can be seen as something that connects people who may not have wanted to be connected originally, but were given a platform to do so on the field or on the sidelines of the field.
Yeah, I think conversation, like, I think we have to sadly bring it to an end. I mean, it was a very insightful session we've had with you.